All right. Well, here it is. It's Friday, and this is the very first episode of Just How I See It, where we talk about the most trending topics in sports and entertainment. But before we get started, I want to make sure I ask you guys to like, comment, share, and subscribe. And once you do that, we'll get right into the topic right after this. All right, so we're back. So today's topic, it's the prime time for understanding the effect and effect of Deion Sanders being at Jackson State amongst the HBCUs. And I know that a lot of people have been talking about this for probably the past almost a month, maybe, since he announced that he would be leaving Jackson State for Colorado. And there have been a lot of opinions about, whether or not he should stay, whether or not he should go, whether or not he's a sellout. And I'm not really going to get into a lot of, taking a side one way or the other. But I did look at it and see there were a lot of interesting areas that I felt like that needed to be addressed for he, as well as Jackson State University, and how that all plays together in regards to his future, as well as the future of Jackson State and HBCUs for that matter. But the first thing I want to do is talk about the history with both Deion as well as Jackson State. We'll start with Deion. Now, Deion comes from Fort Myers, Florida, where he grew up pretty much a poor kid, having a father who was addicted to alcohol and drugs, and having a mother to work multiple jobs just to make sure that he and his siblings were taken care of, and so he used sports as a way to elevate himself. To the point where he could take care of his mother by being drafted by not only the NFL, but actually Major League Baseball. He went on to play for the Atlanta Falcons, the San Francisco 49ers, the Dallas Cowboys, the Washington Redskins, as well as the Baltimore Ravens. He also played baseball for the Yankees, the Cincinnati Reds, and the Atlanta Braves. He's one of the few players that has actually played in a Super Bowl, as well as maybe even the only player to play in the Super Bowl as well as the World Series. So he's quite accomplished. And after his playing days were over, at some point, he decided to start a youth organization in football. And ironically, my son actually played for him for the Truth organization in its first year in existence in Atlanta, Georgia. And that lasted for a while. And so he's always been about the kids in regards to football and their development. And so from there, he went on to coach in high school, and as well as during that time, he was broadcasting for the NFL Network at the time. And he actually stepped away from that because he wanted to really pursue coaching on the college level, because he does have a heart for kids. So from that, he went on to coach at Trinity High School, coaching his son to, I believe it was 3 state championships in a row. His son, and being Shador, being the quarterback of that team. And so he wanted to get into college coaching. And Jackson State afforded him that opportunity when no one else would, whether it be because he didn't have a degree or because they just didn't believe in his ability to coach on that level, because he, quote unquote, didn't have the experience. So now we transition over to Jackson Jackson State. And to talk about Jackson State, you kind of have to talk about the city as well. The city is definitely in one of the poorest states in our country. However, what Jackson is not poor in is love. And it actually is deeply rooted in every person that lives in Jackson. And so when you start talking about Jackson State in the city of Jackson, there is a very close-knit, tightly wound relationship between Jackson and Jackson State University when it comes to football. They love their Jackson State football to the point where, I remember as a kid when we used to live in Jackson, and I remember this game vividly. I think it was 1983, and Jackson State was playing Alcorn State University. And it was pouring down rain. And I was a little kid, so when it began to rain, obviously my father wanted to make sure that he got me home so we wouldn't be sick, or I wouldn't be sick. But what I remember is that as we were leaving, very few people in a very filled stadium were leaving that game. And from there, it showed me the kind of love that the people had for Jackson State and Jackson State football. To sit out in the rain and in the midst of all of that, to see the conclusion of that game in the rain. And so Jackson State, during those time periods, at least definitely in the 80s, and probably before, or definitely before, because keep in mind, Jackson State produced 2 Hall of Famers in the 70s class, and actually another Hall of Famer, I think, in the 60s class, in Lynn Barney, and then 2 more, Robert Brazile, actually 3 more, Robert Brazile, Jackie Slater, and Walter Sweetness Payton. All of them came out of the 70s class. And after that 70s class, the guy by the name of W.C. Gordon took over the program. And during his tenure, W.C. Gordon in the 80s pretty much dominated the 80s. Jackson State dominated the 80s by winning 7 out of the 10 possible championships in the 1980s, earning the nickname Mac of the SWAC. And so Jackson State has a long history of not only winning in the SWAC, but being dominant in the SWAC. When Deion was hired, that was the first time in Jackson State University history that Jackson State had been winless without a conference championship in a decade. That was the first time they had ever gone through a decade without winning a SWAC championship. And so I want to say that because one of the things that seems to have gotten lost in the fanfare and the energy and the hype of Deion Sanders being the coach at Jackson State University, as if Jackson State has never been a winner before his arrival. And that could be the furthest thing from the truth. Jackson State has produced, obviously, again, 4 Hall of Famers. I would say there's a 5th that should be going into the Hall of Fame in Jimmy Smith. It has produced several first-round draft picks. It has produced several draft picks and several players to play in the NFL that may not be in the Hall of Fame, but had very successful careers. I'm talking about going back to the days of Chris Burkett and Sylvester Stamps and Eddie Payton and Darian Connor and Lewis Tillman. I could go on, guy by the name of Victor Hall played tight end, Roy Bennett, who played DB for the San Diego Chargers. Like, Jackson State has produced NFL's players throughout its entire history. And probably before James Houston, that's probably the longest period between 2008 and 21 that Jackson State hasn't had a player to be drafted in the NFL draft in that long of a period. You know, I can think of other guys that people probably would never even imagine or even know about that was drafted from Jackson State. You know, I'm talking about guys by the name of Antonio Kimbrough, who nobody really remembers, or Robert Staten. Or Fernando Smith or Marlo Perry. Like, we've had a long history. And I say we because I once was a football player for Jackson State University. But let's get back to the thick of things, and that is Deion Sanders and Jackson State. Now, there was a lot to be said about him leaving and whether he should go, and he didn't fulfill some of his promises. And I can definitely understand why people would see that and would say that, especially the people of Jackson. And here's why. The people of Jackson, as I mentioned before, is very, very deep and rich in love. And as you can hear some of the players' testimonies, that the love that they received while playing for Jackson State University was something that they had never experienced before. And so that's there. And the big part of that love is because you have a city that has deep roots in its relationship with God and the church. And so when Deion Sanders came to Jackson State University, he said something that resonated with the people of Jackson. And that was, God sent him. The moment he said that God sent him, they were hooked. Period. Because God in love means something to the people of Jackson, Mississippi. And so it stuck with them. And so they held on to it. And here's why. Jackson State, again, as I said before, or Jackson, is in one of the poorest states in our country. And so that's why every little good that they get, they want to hold on to, and which is why they love Jackson State football so much, because it gives them an opportunity to mentally, emotionally escape from their present day of living in Jackson, Mississippi. They saw an opportunity for elevation. They saw an opportunity to be recognized, something that they've all longed for, something that a lot of people don't understand. A lot of what we have in this country in regards to entertainment and even sports, some of our greatest sports figures have ties to Mississippi. Some of our greatest entertainers has ties to Mississippi. And what has happened over time is that these people are raised up in Mississippi, leave Mississippi, and more times than not, they leave it to never to return to Mississippi, leaving Mississippi barren of its resources to actually elevate. And so that's what Deion Sanders represented when he said he had been sent by God, and that God told him that he needed to come to Jackson State, to not only Jackson State, but to help elevate Jackson State and HBCUs on the same playing fields as the FBS and major Power 5 schools. And so Jackson believed him. Why wouldn't you? He said God sent him. So why is Jackson State upset? Is what people ask. He came, he brought attention to it. He spent his own money to help get things finished at the school. He did a lot for the school. Well, here's the thing. What Jackson State was looking for him to do wasn't based off of what he was able to pay financially, but what he said that he would do because of who sent him. And that was God. And that there would be a change because that's what God sent him there to do, to change things. And a lot of people think that he did. And that's fair. Now, what I believe Deion does not understand or did not fully understand, and seems as though he still doesn't fully understand, is him leaving. He left at a time where a lot of people could see the light at the end of the tunnel. And so they felt hurt or betrayed because you didn't seem to see it through on what you said God sent you there to do. Now, before I get into that, I want to talk about some of the issues that Deion said that he had in regards to Jackson, and that, he felt like he couldn't do it by himself, that he needed help from other people that were within the situation. And I would say he would be right that he would need help. And this is where I think Jackson State actually kind of dropped the ball in the situation. A lot of talk has been said about how much alumni gives back. And, that's why we weren't able to, give him the kind of money that he needed to pay himself and pay his assistants and things like that. Well, first of all, I heard a statement by Roland Martin, and he said that he had talked with the president of Jackson State. And the president said, that only 13% of the alumni actually gave back to the school. Now, to most, when you hear that number, it's like, oh, man, only 13%. Y'all should have lost Deion. Y'all don't even want to get back to your own school. Here's the thing. If you look at the national average of alumni giving back to schools, and that means PWIs as well as HBCUs involved, the national average for alumni giving back to their prospective schools is 23%. Some are higher than 23. Some are definitely lower than 23. Actually, I was reading an article from Forbes about alumni giving back to their schools, and I happened to run across two schools in particular. One of those schools was Baylor University, who alumni account for 8% of the money given to the school. I also ran across the University of Miami, and their alumni account for 12.4% of money given back to the school. However, Baylor is able to pay their coaches. And I saw a chart today to where Colorado University, where Deion is now the head coach of, only 8% of their income comes from alumni or donors. However, they are paying $5 million a year to Deion, along with $5 million toward his staff. Baylor pays their coach $6 million a year, and the University of Miami pays their coach $8 million a year. So based off 8%, and 12%, there is no way that that pays their coaches' salaries. Now, I don't know the laws in Texas in regards to public schools or private schools or how much you can pay someone. But I do know that based on their percentage, the alumni ain't footing the bill for that $60 million or $8 million a year. So what does that mean for Jackson State? Well, at 13%, that, number one, is higher than those of the schools. And yet, they are not able to pay their coaches a 7-figure salary. And so I began to actually dive a little deeper, and what I come to understand, and it's something that actually FAMU did about 6 years ago, and they created a booster club specifically to make sure that its main sport was the benefactor of the donations or the income that was made specific for the football program. But also honoring the fact that there are other sports, that they will also be of assistance to the other sports with what they were able to bring in regards to donations to this booster club. And so what happens in a lot of cases with a lot of these schools is they have different foundations and booster clubs and nonprofit organizations to actually bring in donors to make sure that these coaches have salaries that are attracted them to either want to be a coach there or to stay a coach there. And to be honest, that's something that Jackson State does not have. Now, do they have an athletic booster club? Yes, they do. But their primary goal isn't necessarily football. It is to make sure that all athletics are taken care of. But there isn't one that is specific just for football. And so what happens when we bring in ticket sales, which, by the way, Jackson State's ticket average about $30 per ticket. And last year, Jackson State averaged about 42,000 fans per home game. That's about $1.3 million per home game that the school brings in just off tickets alone. Now, I don't know how that money is spent or where that money is put to. However, I do know that that money does go into the general fund of the school, and then the school decides to disperse it where they see fit. And that's fine. But if that's going to be the practice for the ticket sales, and there needs to be an opportunity for the football program to have separate boosters in order for our football program to grow to the level in which we believe that it can. And that's something that was sorely missing in this Deion situation. And that's something that I do believe that Jackson State needs to look into in order for our program to be able to not only grow, but to be competitive and elevate. Now, when it comes to Deion, I'm happy that he was able to do what he said he was going to do for his coaching staff and able to pay them and get them the kind of salaries that could definitely change their lives. And I honestly believe that Deion's decision, he had to choose between two causes. One cause was to elevate Jackson State and in so elevating HBCUs to a level to where now, where there are no HBCUs on the FBS level, that there will be some HBCUs on the FBS level. And truthfully, understanding how some of the dynamics work with HBCUs, that is a very hefty weight to bear, and that you would need help. You would need cooperation. You would need ways to ensure that things continue to grow as they needed to. And then he had the cause of helping those and elevating those who've been with him since that Truth organization, and elevating those who he has met along the way, such as a Coach Dancy from Mississippi Valley, such as Coach Shad, that was a grad assistant and now is an assistant on the Colorado team, as well as the guys that have been with him from day one, from Coach Hart to Coach Mathis, to Coach DT. Quite a few people he wanted to help out and bring up in this process. And I just don't think Jackson State was prepared enough to ensure that happened for him and his staff. And that's something that we need to definitely look forward to doing, not for him, but in the future. But again, to Deion, here's where I think Deion needs to actually really, really take a look. And that is, when you mention God sending you somewhere, you have to understand that, number one, how people will take that, how people will look at you saying God sent you. And when you say God sent you there for a cause, I can rest assure you that most people aren't going to look at as 2 years as being enough. And here's why. Throughout the Bible, God has sent people to deliver people. He sent Moses to deliver people. He sent Jesus to deliver people. He sent Joseph to deliver people, for example. And when God has sent people to bring change, to bring deliverance, number one, God did not remove them from the situation until the work was done, to what he actually sent them there to do actually happened. And he did not send them there to say, hey, this is how you make it happen. They were actually the leader in making those things happen. And they stayed around until that work was finished, unless they got to the point like Moses, where the leader himself, the man that God sent, disobeyed God. That is when God removed the man from the situation and sent someone else. There was also another time where the people wanted a king, and the people chose Saul. Even though God told them to be patient and wait, the people said, no, God, we want Saul. And he gave them Saul, and they eventually regretted doing so. And so what I would say to Deion is that, number one, if God sent you, it's not for a blueprint. It's actually for the work to be done. That means whatever comes with that. If he sent you, it's for the work to be finished with you leading the way. Number two, God never sends someone into a situation to lead people for the elevation of the leader. When he sent Moses to deliver the people from Egypt, it was not for Moses to be elevated. It was to free the people, and the people were to be blessed by him being there. And the only reason why Moses did not lead the people into the promised land was not because he was frustrated with the people. And so God said, all right, well, I'm going to move you on. No. The reason why Moses did not enter the promised land with the people was because he allowed his frustration with the people made him disobey God. And that's why he did not lead the people into the promised land. But then there is Jesus, who God sent him on this earth to lead people to salvation. And so that salvation was something that could be offered because he came and he spread the gospel or spread the word of God to the people and freed them from law, to give them grace and to give them salvation that was once believed that was only reserved for the Jews. But because of Jesus, it was now made available for everybody. And so when God does something, for lack of a better word, it sticks. There is no loss in the aftermath. And so one of the things that I have noticed in this aftermath is that a lot of the attention and some players, like there was a lot of loss for Jackson State in this situation. And I don't know, I've never seen a situation where if it was a God thing, that the situation that was meant to be changed did not sustain. And so that's why you have to make sure that what you're doing is definitely God sent, or else you could mess up a lot of people in that situation. And so, you know, I know that Deion said that he had prayed and, if he heard God the first time, that he, don't question whether or not he heard him the second time. To be honest, none of us ever get God every time. None of us do. And I'm not saying that God didn't tell Deion it's time to go. I'm not saying that he said that. But what I am saying is that when God tells you to go, he's going to make sure that you leave the situation, not just in physical things, but leave the change that you were sent there to be or to do, that it stays intact. And that's speculative whether or not that actually happened or not. But I know a lot of times the answers to our frustrations can sometimes seem that's God answering us. And the truth of the matter is that's just the enemy's way of getting you away from a situation that he knows that if you stay, the glory that God will get from that situation will be so great that he can't keep those people down. And so, to close, Jackson State, I would say it's time to get out of the 80s and 90s and even early 2000s, how we operate, especially when it comes to our athletics and when it comes to how we bring in money for our athletics and honestly, the sport that generates the most money for the school. in order for us to grow. And I would say to Deion, God's elevation doesn't look like man's elevation. And sometimes our elevation comes in situations that seems to be unwinnable. But remember, if God sent you, he's going to do it in his strength. Not in your time, but his. And so to be careful when you say God sent you, if you're going to allow frustration to move you off of what God's told you to do. So that's what I got. You can comment, tell me what you think about it. And I may actually do a live where I can actually take questions and talk about it and discuss it with people. But until then, my name is Ojur, and that's just how I see it. See you soon.